Dr. Michael L. Brock is the winner of the Carl Rogers Prize in Pastoral Psychology. His degree is the Doctor of Psychology, and the name of his project is Journeys of Faith, Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, Eric Fromm, and Rollo May, and the spiritual arc of the humanistic psychology movement. Dr. Brock?
Thank you, Dr. Clayton. Well, as mentioned, the title of my presentation is Carl Rogers, A Person-Centered Journey to the Spiritual. That is a chapter out of my dissertation, which has a longer title. Carl Rogers was a counselor. I call him a counselor's counselor. If you've never before done so, look him up on YouTube and watch him conduct a counseling session. His eyes focused and intent, his body leaning in toward the client, words uttered ever so softly and sparingly, as if to pay homage to the old prescription, don't speak unless you can improve upon the silence. With Rogers, how far we've come from Freud, seated magisterially, notebook in hand, just behind his patient's reclining head, or Jung and Adler pontificating behind their massive mahogany desks, or so many others struggling to make the spiritual transition from patient to client to person. With Rogers, we have two persons in deep communication. We have the I-thou relationship in the counselor's office, and he's still the model for us today. My first introduction to the Rogerian approaches to interpersonal relationships was through a 3-day workshop training I attended 26 years ago, a time which I knew nothing about Carl Rogers, if I even knew the name. Nor did I hear his name mentioned during the workshop. By that time, the humanistic principles Rogers and others had advanced had become so imbued in the psychological culture that they had taken on a life of their own, independent of their original proponents. But I wasn't in that culture then. I was a school principal living in a completely different world, with only the most rudimentary background in psychology, attending a workshop that would eventually point me toward a new life path, a change of careers at midlife to a field I'd never before considered, counseling. What we were learning at that training was how to work with people within a humanistic, person-centered approach. And by the third day, we participants were on fire, I dare say, with the Spirit. Both the medium, the workshop leader, and the group dynamics he helped us create, and the message, a new way of working with people in homes, schools, churches, on the job, indeed in all dimensions of life, were exactly what so many of us in attendance needed. I certainly needed it. On the morning of the third and final day, a young lady who hailed from a traditional, culturally Catholic background shared with us that when she got home after the second day, she was exuding with such enthusiasm and at such length about what she was getting in touch with, that her husband, somewhat concerned, stopped her mid-sentence and asked, "But are you still Catholic?" Each of us at that training could relate to her story. What we were learning was transformational. We would never look at interpersonal relations the same again. Brian Thorne, an associate and biographer of Rogers, writes that, quote, "The secular experience of person-centered groups in particular seems for some people to open up a channel into spiritual terrain which has previously remained unexplored and whose very existence has been denied," unquote. It did so for Rogers both as participant and as leader, and it did for me 26 years ago at that workshop. Thorne, who's the founder of the Norwich Center for Personal and Professional Development in England, says of Rogers that, quote, "The clue to the essential continuity in his development as a person lies in the hiddenness of his spiritual pilgrimage." He highlights Rogers' development from within the harsh, judgmental Christianity of his upbringing, through his dismissal of the religion of his birth, and in his final years to a discovery of the spiritual, mystical dimension of life, characteristically through his own personal experiences, particularly in person-centered groups. Rogers was a Midwesterner, born in 1902, just west of Chicago, of parents whose roots in America trace back to the 17th century, the century of pilgrims and the separatists. And separatism describes Carl's upbringing as well as it does his religious roots. The family preached and practiced a sense of being of the elect, an elitist separatism from the temptations of the world. Rogers noted that the message he and his siblings received about those outside the family was, quote, to keep away from any close communication with them and to live your life within the family. Come ye out from among them and be ye separate is a good biblical text to follow, unquote. Separatism and a prototypically American Puritan work ethic affected all dimensions of Rogers' upbringing. His was a family environment characterized by rituals and routines, from family meals to family worship to the various farm chores, experiences often absent in today's families, much to our detriment. Prayer and Bible reading were a daily occurrence of the highest priority, with productive work a close second. It was also a family of love, not the intimate love that Carl so much needed, but a patriarchal, matriarchal love that kept things together, a character-forming love, offering both something to believe in and something to rebel from. Thorne, who sees deep religious strivings in Rogers throughout his life, wonders what course his life would have taken had the family atmosphere been characterized by a more embracing theology and less separatist religious experiences. Perhaps, quote, a much-loved pastor and theologian whose life could have transformed the face of the church. Carl's movement away from the religion of his birth started, ironically, with a mission trip to China, and with hundreds of other burgeoning missionaries from all over the world. What he learned from that experience was that good people could hold very different religious opinions, and that the religious world in which he was raised was not the only one possible. Upon returning to America and entering Union Theological Seminary, his opinions began to veer more and more away from the Christianity of his youth, so much so that he would soon abandon it altogether. So how then did Carl Rogers come to embrace the spiritual? Thorne explains this movement in terms of his growing ability to experience intimacy with others. Interestingly, through his counseling practice and his group experiences, both as a participant and as a leader. His three classic necessary and sufficient requirements for change, congruence, unconditional positive regard, and empathy, seemed to take on greater power for him when more were involved. And it was particularly in these group settings that the presence of the spiritual emerged for him. Provide the three conditions and the Spirit emerges. Wherever two or more are gathered in my name, I am there. In Rogers' last published description of a therapeutic encounter, he noted, quote, I am impelled to believe that I, like many others, have underestimated the importance of this mystical spiritual dimension. He was now discovering it. And pastoral counselors discovered him. In his emphasis on congruence, unconditional positive regard, and empathy, many in the Christian churches saw the human characteristics of Jesus, a man who spoke his truth consistently and authentically, who preached forgiveness and commanded us to love, and whose behavior and stories exuded an empathic understanding of the human condition. Rogers would find his path to God through the human encounter. In Ladislaus Boros's classic study, The Mystery of Death, he examines that moment that we must all face, and opines that in the very moment of the passage from life to death, we come face to face with God. And at that moment, each of us is confronted with one final choice, to say yes or to say no, a choice for which all of life has prepared us. Something about Carl Rogers coming to the moment of his death and encountering the face of God and looking intently into that face, as he would so often do with his clients, fully facing them, fully encountering them, presents an immensely hopeful image to me. I suspect that both Carl and God would have been pleased with the encounter. Thank you.